So thank you, everybody. Welcome to Wellness Wednesday here at TBH. As you all know, there are many topics that we talk about and some that are more difficult than others to speak about. But although they're difficult, we don't want to not talk about them, or, it's not anything that we can just shove under the rug because it's not going to go away. So here with us today, we have Dr. Daphne Pozzo, who is going to talk to us and walk us through it's like a trifecta, right? Depression, suicide, and self-harm, and how that affects our youth. So welcome, Daphne. Thank you for being here, taking the time. So, and I know we've done this before, but for our new viewers, if you could just give a little bit of background.
Of course.
Great.
So like Veronica said, my name is Dr. Daphne Pozzo, and I am a registered marriage and family therapist intern, hopefully licensed soon. And so I've been working with youth and specifically teens for, I think, 5-6 years now, in an outpatient setting. And then I also did some internship hours during my master's program on an adolescent and child psychiatric unit. And so the majority of my focus has been with teenagers and young adults and kind of the struggles that they are currently dealing with in today's society.
Mm-hmm. Great. So there's no which way to go about it, right? When we're talking about these topics. And as most of you know that you've been on with us before, we do like this very interactive Q&A. So at any time, feel free to just post some questions in the chat or the Q&A. This is your chance to ask the experts. That's what we bring them here for. They're a wealth of information and knowledge. So this is a time to take advantage of that. But one of the things that we really like to talk about, especially with our youth and specifically here in Broward County. But what would you say, or what are you seeing now that's different from even when you first started? Do you see a trend? Do you see any changes on what is affecting our kids?
Oh my gosh, I think with Corona has been a big thing, and I know it's been a big thing for a multitude of reasons. But the fact is that now, because people were quarantining or still quarantining, there's still people who, haven't left the home, they're feeling isolated. Right. And as we know, isolation and not having really, friendships or family there to support you is a big factor when it comes to depression and ultimately possibly dying by suicide.
Right. Now we have virtual learning.
Yes.
Right. So with the virtual learning, which, it's a great platform for its uses and all that. And, but because everybody, not just the kids, but because we're all being isolated for so long, and now the kids are continuing that isolation through the virtual learning. And, and I would imagine, we talk about how kids being on the computer or on their electronics for so many hours a day, and now they need to be on it even longer because of school. So that's got to be making an impact in their minds as well. There's really no turn off. There hasn't been any downtime. So what do you see that, maybe what do you think that they can be doing differently?
So going back to, I think one of the major struggles with quarantine, I'm sorry, I want to kind of refer back to that. The fact that families, for the first time, and I think in a very long time, are all in the same household for extended periods of time. Right. And, there is nowhere to go. I mean, luckily now there are some, new places where families can go to, but for about 5 or 6 months, families were like this pressure cooker of stress. And so a lot of times clients would come in and say, I can't be around my family anymore. I can't deal with my mom anymore. All she does is yell. And so it's a lot of factors being played out at once because of the fact that these are unprecedented times. Nothing like this has ever happened before. Right. And so it's the stress of being in a pandemic. It's the stress of trying to navigate virtual learning, which is, I'm sure, very difficult because I've heard many stories. Right. It's very difficult. Right. It's navigating, now that the kids are home, how am I supposed to go to work if I'm, the kids need supervision, but I need to work, and how am I supposed to make money? So it's not only the teenagers and the kids going through all these stressors, but it's also the parents. And so when all the stress is put together, of course, there's going to be, symptoms coming up, like the child is isolating in their room and they don't want to come out because they don't want to interact with anybody. The child child is, you know, acting out maybe in impulsive ways, doing things virtually or online, because let's face it, before you could say, you know, today you're only going to be on the computer for 2 hours. Now there's no limit, because
Right.
everything is online now, everything is virtual. So there's no limits that you can really put on kids. But I mean, with regards to what family could be doing different, I mean, like I said, so virtual learning is obviously online, but maybe taking away the computer or the phone after a certain amount of time, just so that they can interact with the family. And I know that sometimes the teens may not want to interact with the family, but interaction with family is very important, as difficult as it may be, even if it's just watching a movie together as a family, playing board games, anything. You could get creative with it, anything that will interact the child or the teenager with the family.
Okay, so now if we're talking about now, obviously they're much more online, right? They're with their technology, which we don't have much of a choice.
Right.
And that's going from adults to kids and all of that. But now, what do you see, you know, what are some of the symptoms, I would say, not what you see, but what could be some of the signs that we can look out for? You know, because we talk about one of the biggest concerns with mental health is depression, right? So, and depression is, I would imagine, is one of the major issues that can lead to suicide. But so what would be some of the signs that we can look out for? Because when I first thought about depression, I'm thinking, oh, you're sad, but that's not the only emotion that one shows.
Right. Okay. Good question. So with depression, and I guess I'll present it in different ways, because for kids it can present in one way versus teenagers, you know, versus adults. So for example, with kids, because kids don't necessarily know how to express their feelings, it could show up as physical symptoms. So for example, not necessarily paying attention in class, having a hard time sleeping at night, even just like inquiring about different methods of possibly even dying. So they'll ask questions of, you know, what poisons and what does this poison do versus that poison. So they'll be much more curious about different ways of dying. And I think a big misconception is kids can't get depressed, or kids can't die by suicide, and that's not true at all. In fact, I think one of the studies that I read about found that kids, not only do they attempt and die by suicide, they do so in a manner of hanging. And in a lot of these cases, the parents had no idea that their child was even having these thoughts, which is why I think talking about it is so important, but that's for a later time. And then with teenagers, they could be, you know, acting out, isolating. And there's a big difference between normal isolation of, Mom, I don't want to hang out with you this weekend. I'm like, ugh, like, I don't want to hang out with you, versus I'm not hanging out with anybody. I'm not hanging out with friends. I'm not hanging out with people that I used to hang out with. I'm not doing anything except staying in my room or you know, keeping to myself. And also this sense of just feeling hopeless, like things aren't going to get better. And this is true also for adults, just feeling like things are never going to get better. It's kind of like this gray cloud just always on top of you. And a big thing about depression is that it affects your biological function. So you're either eating too much or eating too little. You're sleeping too much, sleeping too little. And then this depression can also lead to thoughts of, you know, self-harm, you know, cutting yourself, inflicting pain on yourself. And it could ultimately also lead to thoughts of, maybe I just shouldn't be here. Maybe life would be better without me. And so those are some of the biggest, I think, behaviors that we see with, you know, the different age groups and depression and suicide.
So there's definitely, I mean, I would imagine you're going to have some, how would I rephrase this or word this, but when you're looking at their body language, you know, especially now within the virtual setting, I mean, you can see what you know, you always talk about, oh, there's steam coming out of their ears. You can see that steam, and obviously there's literally not steam coming out. But so I would imagine that might be something that as whether you're teaching a class or even the parents that see the kids that they're within their stations in their home, that they can see somewhat their body language, and maybe that might help point them into some direction. Now, I would imagine as well is that, like you mentioned, that everything, I mean, there's a lot of stress right now, period. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of, I would say probably more anxiety, just because we can't go out, we can't do the things that we were doing before. And as you mentioned, the kids treat that differently or act differently than adults do. But, when we're dealing with that, how can we communicate more with the kids? Because I know that that's always difficult for many people. How do you broach the subject? Because many questions that we ask are fine, yes, no. So they're not really good answers, and we're not really getting to the meat of the problem. But as your first line, being the parents, or the first line point of contact, how can we have these conversations with our kids without feeling that, oh, we're leading them or giving them ideas?
Right. And so I think my biggest tip to not only parents, but to anybody, is to get comfortable talking about suicide. I think as a society, we're kind of scared to speak about suicide. Obviously, it's a horrible phenomenon that occurs, but it occurs. And so just getting comfortable talking about self-harm, suicide, depression, not treating it, as a stigma or something that should be hush-hush or behind closed doors. No, this is something that we need to talk about. So first of all, getting comfortable speaking about suicide, and then being willing to have that conversation with your child. Asking them, have you been having thoughts of self-harm? Have you been having thoughts of, not wanting to be here anymore? And letting them know that it's a safe environment for them. It's all about that body language and that tone. Don't come at them at like saying, you need to tell me right now if you're suicidal. You need to tell me right now if you're self-harming, because that'll just make them shut down. And so coming to them from a place of non-judgment, but support and wanting to help is a very good place to come from. And if you don't feel comfortable talking about it, seek help. Don't just think that because you don't talk about it, it's not going to happen, or that, like you mentioned, if you talk about it, you're putting the idea in their head. If they're thinking about suicide, the idea is already in their head. If there's nothing that you could potentially ask that would make them, do it quicker, or there's nothing, all the fears that you're potentially thinking of probably aren't going to happen, just because generally people who are having thoughts of suicide do want to talk about it. And I will refer to this book during this conversation. It's called Myths About Suicide by Thomas Joyner. Definitely a really good book, especially for parents, but people in general. And so the reason I bring that up is because he writes about this study in which I think 500 plus people were basically analyzed because they were going to jump off the Golden Gate Bridge. And I'm not sure if you know this, but the Golden Gate Bridge is a huge place for people to die by suicide. And so of those 500 people, they started, they talked them down from the bridge in a very, empathetic and supporting manner, and helped them down. And I think the majority of them went on to lead productive lives and got better from whatever they were feeling, but it was because somebody stopped them, somebody reached out to them, and somebody helped them, so that they, thought, oh, okay, so things have a chance that they can get better. This person cares about me.
And that's one of the things that I've been reading up on, trying to better familiarize myself, especially in talking about suicide, is that it's usually based on what's going on at that moment. It's not permanent, is what I was reading, because a lot of times we might think, once they've attempted, or once those thoughts are there, that you always have to walk on eggshells, right?
Gosh, no.
That they're always going to be suicidal. And that's not the case.
No, at all. Actually, and I marked some of these because there are some quotes that I thought would be really helpful to have. But it was basically this man, he died, he completed his suicide, and when the police went to go investigate in his home, he left a letter saying, if somebody smiles to me on the way to the bridge, I'm not going to do it. And then it's assumed that nobody smiled to him, but even something as small as smiling to someone prevents them from trying or attempting to die by suicide. So it shows that at the end of the day, human connection is stronger than we give it credit for.
Right. Right. And what was the name of the book and the author again?
It is Myths About Suicide by Thomas Joyner. Amazing book. Amazing.
Yeah, there's quite a bunch of myths apparently that we're looking at, and I'm more of a factual numbers. Like I like to know the facts. You know, what's the truth by this, by that, and so when I start looking at all that, and you see all these myths, and you know, I mean, if we're just reading story time, you know, bedtime stories, it's fine.
Right.
But with situations and topics that are extremely sensitive and important, it's amazing what's out there. And what I find amazing too is that the numbers, and when we're looking at our kids, because I was one of those that would never think that kids would think about these things. Now, I know there's a lot of movies and shows that might glorify these things and make it trendy. You know, I mean, we're big trendsetters here, and I'd say South Florida, but Broward County, our numbers don't lie, and our numbers are a lot greater than the national average, which again was always surprising to me. You know, because I always say, look, we have the beach, we have this, we have that. But, you know, this is where we get into some of the pressures. I mean, what would you say based on your experience with the kids? I mean, what are all these pressures that are really pushing them to the edge, you know? Because we're not all born with chemical imbalances, right? Some of it is based on our environment. Some of it is based on, you know, the whole nurture versus nature. But what would you say, you know, based on your experience, obviously, what would you say what are the top few issues or concerns that are really putting that pressure on our kids?
And so I will preface it by saying that I do believe genetics plays a huge role. So it's shown that generationally, if you know your parent had depression, you're more likely to have depression. And there was also one study in the book that said that twins, if one twin died by suicide, the other one had an increased risk of dying by suicide. So there's a genetic component. And I think that mental health and mental illness is a huge factor playing a role in all of this. But specifically with kids and teenagers, what we're seeing now, at least in my experience, is the presence of technology, the presence of social media, which
is not going to go away.
Right. It's only going to increase, if anything. But, you know, back in my day when I was growing up, sure, we had, you know, MySpace, but it wasn't as predominant as it is right now. You know, you had to pay for text messages. Nowadays, text messages are free. And everything is at the click of a button. And so if someone, let's say, because teenagers, they do tend to be impulsive because that part of the brain isn't fully developed yet. And so they make more impulsive decisions than, say, a 20-something-year-old adult. Let's say if they are already feeling, you know, thoughts of self-harm or thoughts of suicide, and then they research and they have it all at their fingertips. They can research how to die by suicide or what they can do. And also, and I wanted to bring this up because this is a big thing, is clusters. So it shows that if a teenager is aware that someone they know or someone in their hometown died by suicide, there's an increased risk for that teenager to attempt suicide. And it's the same thing with if a celebrity dies by suicide, the teenagers and other people, but mainly teenagers, are also at an increased risk of dying by suicide after that time. And a lot of it has to do with the way that media kind of in a way glorifies that person's suicide. And so the teenager who's already feeling, you know, pretty hopeless, pretty worthless, they feel like nothing's ever going to get better, and then they see that, you know, the celebrity died and everyone's talking about them for a week or 2 weeks, and they just see it as a new way out. They see it as something that could potentially help them in the long run.
Right. I mean, and we're definitely seeing that here. I mean, we know that, you know, death by suicide is the second leading cause of death for our kids. And we know here in Broward County, I mean, there's such, I mean, when we look at the numbers just in Broward County, it's devastating. You know, we have 1 in 5 kids have some kind of mental or behavioral health situation. And we're not having to talk about that. It doesn't have to be some major, you know, conditions. We're talking about your day-to-day, your anxieties, your depressions, your self-harm. And then, you know, again, it trickles down to getting, obviously, if it's not taken care of, if we're not doing our self-check, if we're not, you know, whether it is that we need, you know, someone else to talk to, you know, in addition to our families, if we don't use those resources or have those resources, then it just becomes a domino effect, right? Then the end result becomes the worst thing that you want to talk about, right? So, but how, you know, now we're seeing, going back a little bit on self-harm, we're seeing that more and more. Now we know that in the past 6 years, there's been like a 300% increase in self-harm. I mean, those numbers to me are like staggering. I mean, how could it be so great? You know, and these kids, I mean, obviously they're finding, it doesn't take much to find something to self-harm with, right? So, but how does it get to that point? You know, is that usually also starting from a depression or anxiety, or, you know, how does self-harm fit into that category?
So for me, I think that there is a strong link between, you know, mental health and self-harming. And so but I think there's a third component into it. So maladaptive coping skills. So using coping skills that aren't necessarily helping them can lead to self-harm, because if you have these coping skills in place and you have a strong support system, then your likelihood of self-harming is lessened. But if your coping skills include harming yourself, and this is the only way you feel better, and I will say that studies show that when you do self-harm, because the threshold between pain and pleasure is so narrow, that you do get that, you know, rush in your brain and that relief, and so it temporarily relieves that anxiety, that depression, those feelings of, you know, hopelessness in that moment that person may be having. But then it becomes a pattern, and so every time that person may want to feel better, or is, you know, not feeling that great, they may self-harm in order for those chemicals in your brain to rush through you and then momentarily feel better. And so a lot of what we do here is trying to teach the kids to have more effective coping skills, to find other ways of getting that rush without necessarily harming yourself. And I will say this because I think a lot of people believe that because someone self-harms, they want to die by suicide, and that's not generally always the case.
Right. And that's kind of, and not to add one more topic, but that's kind of sometimes when kids or people obviously, you know, tend to self-medicate, right? Whether it's, you know, with alcohol even, you know, because there's something obviously not right. And then they think that the alcohol is making them feel better when it's actually doing the opposite.
And it's always a temporary effect. You know, you may feel better for 3, 4, 5 hours, but, and especially with the case with alcohol, since it is a depressant, the next day the person wakes up feeling, you know, substantially worse. And so then they might keep drinking because that's what they think is going to help them feel better.
Right. So there are different types of skills or coping skills, as you mentioned, that when they begin to self-harm, that you can help, you know, so that they can redirect and get that, you know, different, I don't know if it's the mind waves or what it is that's working, so that they don't, you know, it counteracts or it benefits the person. So now when is too much when someone self-harms? Like, you know, when do you know that you need to take your child or that adolescent to the hospital or to an inpatient facility, as opposed to, you know, hopefully before it gets to that DEFCON 10, you know, when can you hopefully attack that where you can help them in other ways before it gets to that point?
Right. And so my suggestion to parents, if they ever suspect self-harm or they see something is going on, definitely seek therapy for their child. And because if they are able to target that behavior from the very beginning, it's much different than, let's say, if I get a client who has been self-harming for the past 5-10 years, that's very different than someone who self-harmed once and the parents immediately brought them in, because then it becomes this pattern of, this is what I do to make to help myself feel better.
Right.
And so with teenagers especially, I think it's very important for parents to be aware of any changes in the child's mood. If the child is wearing sweaters and we're in South Florida, like, why are you wearing a sweater? Like, I would definitely be aware of that kind of, and I know nowadays teenagers love to wear sweaters and it's a big thing now, but I would have that in mind, that even just changes in their behavior. So are they more isolated? Are they more withdrawn? Or are they not as interested in stuff that they used to be interested in? So that's what I would be aware of. And so definitely seek treatment for that child or teenager once you start suspecting that something isn't quite what you think it should be. And I'd say, like, follow your gut as to what you believe. And when it comes to whether or not I should Baker Act my child, if they are, you know, pretty big cuts and you become aware of these cuts, you should immediately contact law enforcement, or have them voluntarily hospitalized or Baker acted, because the safety of the child is always the number one concern. And we don't want anything, you know, God forbid, anything gets infected or they cut too deep or anything like that. And part of what I do as a therapist is I try to always make a safety plan when I know someone has a history of self-harm. Even if they aren't actively self-harming right now, I create a safety plan. So it's a collaborative way of me and the client kind of saying, okay, if I start having thoughts, just thoughts of wanting to self-harm, this is what I'm going to do instead. This is who I'm going to reach out to. So they always know, if it's not an immediate emergency and they just want to vent, they can write me an email. They can, you know, let me know what's going on. And then if that helps them feel better, and so they are able to distract themselves from that moment and then, you know, keep going. And they also have, you know, access to phone numbers that they can contact, like the suicide hotline, which is a very important number to know. And so just kind of trying to keep the teenager safe while also allowing them to express what it is that they're going through.
Right. Now, if you're talking about some of those myths, and I didn't mean to redirect you. what would you? And I know we mentioned about talking about suicide, where you know, people think that you might, you know, encourage them, or,
to do it.
So aside from that, what would you say some of the other top myths that people believe, you know, when dealing or talking about suicide?
So I will say that, so from this book, I learned that with suicide, two of the biggest factors are the fact that you feel like you don't belong. So that's a big one. So feeling like you're not belonging anywhere, like not even with your family, not with friends. So you're kind of isolating yourself because you don't feel like you belong. And also believing you're a burden to others. That's a big one, because if you believe you're a burden to others, if you're thinking about suicide, then you're actually thinking that you're helping your family by dying by suicide. You're helping your friends because you're not going to be here anymore, so they don't have to worry about you. And so I think a big myth is that people, you know, they look very poorly, right, the days before leading up to the suicide or suicide attempt. They look, you know, just very depressed and withdrawn. And actually, this book says that many people generally look the same, if not even calmer, because they've kindly come to terms with this decision of, I'm going to do this and I'm going to end my life. But again, it goes back to the fact that as humans, our natural instinct is to survive. It's ingrained in us. That's why we get anxious or an adrenaline when we're in these risky behaviors.
The fight or flight.
Yes, because our natural instinct is to survive. And so I think that what people need or should understand is the fact that if someone tries to die by suicide or wants to die by suicide, it's because they're experiencing so much pain that it overtakes their natural instinct to survive. And another myth that I learned was the fact that because we watch movies and I mean, personally, I don't know anyone who's died by suicide, but from the movies, they always say that the person leaves a letter. The person leaves a letter, and
no, they don't.
They don't.
Yeah.
They don't. And even if they do,
I never realized that, but now that you mention that, you know, that's interesting, because that's the first thing that people, now I do know a few people that have, and that's the first thing that their, you know, their loved ones, their spouses had said. Did they leave the letter? Where's the letter? You know, because they need a reason, right? or what did they have to say?
Yes.
You know, so it's interesting you said that, because I've never put two and two together with movies.
Mhm.
You know, because of course they glorify
Of
everything.
course, and they make it kind
Yeah.
of different than what it actually presents us. But actually, 25% of completed suicides leave a note.
Wow.
And so that's only, you know, 1 in 4. And
Yeah.
when they do leave a note, people expect it to be like in the movies where it's like, oh, I did it because of this, and this is what I was going through. But actually, the book says that it's like kind of day-to-day stuff. Like, remember on Monday you have to take the kids to school. Remember on Wednesday you have to feed the cat. It's very mundane and matter of fact, more so than
Right.
actual like emotions, and this is why I did it, and this was what I was going through.
Yeah. And I would imagine with kids or adolescents, you're less chances of getting any kind of letter,
It could be.
right? So, and again, there are no statistics on that. I
Right.
have no idea.
I have no idea. I just know the 25% of people leave
Yeah.
a letter.
Yeah, I wouldn't, yeah, not sure about that. But it's, you know, it's interesting and sad at the same time, of course, when we're talking about these sensitive issues now. And now we know, based on statistics, that females tend to have more thoughts, suicidal thoughts, versus the men tend to actually follow through.
Yes.
Okay. And now can you talk a little bit about the gender differences, and in addition to, you know, so we have, you know, whether female, male, and then we have the LGBTQ.
Yes.
So, which is another factor.
I'm glad you brought that up, because I was going to bring that up too. But the gender differences, and I don't know what the actual statistic is, so don't quote me on this, is the fact that men choose more lethal means of attempting suicide. So for example, men, I think, are more likely to use a gun versus women, who are more likely to, let's say, overdose on painkillers. And so, you know, there's a big difference in time versus, you know, shooting yourself in whatever part of your body where you could automatically just pass away, versus taking these pills. And I think, I don't know how much time you have before you pass, but there's time.
Right, there's time.
There's time. And I actually found this out the other day as I was studying for my licensure test, but the number one group that's at highest risk for completing suicide are elderly males. And it's because of the fact that, you know, a lot of their friends and families have passed away, and so they're feeling extra isolated, and see that as their one of the ways to kind of end things.
Right. Yes, I've read that's the number one cause, where we know in adolescents, you know, and actually from 10 to 34, there's different, you know, different studies, but from 10 to 34, it's the second leading cause of death. But even if you look at 15 to 24 as well. So basically with our adolescents up to young adults, it is the second leading cause of death, which is crazy. You know, I mean, it's sad. Cancer is number 5. So, you know, when you look at these numbers, and we know it's prevalent here. I mean, when we look at, let's look at Broward County for a second. So Broward County, we have about 310,000 kids in school in Broward County. That's a big number. And now if we're looking at high school, now this is back when 2017 numbers. So 15.5% of the high school students actually have reported seriously considered suicide. 13.3% are developing a plan on how to commit suicide or die by suicide, and 11.1% actually reported attempting at least once. I mean, these numbers are, it's astonishing, because again, they're kids, and you know, we always hope at the best for the kids. We want to provide a healthy and safe environment for them. You know, it's obviously, it's more prevalent also in rural versus metropolitan areas, which I would think, you know, with all those high rises and everything else, it would be different, but it's not. So, you know, we want to, obviously here at TBH, we want to provide resources. We want to provide a safe, you know, a safe haven, a healthy environment, and be that resource. Because I mean, sometimes we're not going to necessarily be the fit but we can help direct you to the correct fit. But we want to be able to provide, you know, experts such as, you know, Daphne being here and talking about all this. And you know, there's a wealth of information out there, and we definitely encourage everybody to look at it. But you know, we know it takes a community, right? It really takes everybody to raise our kids. So and those are some of the things that we'd like to bring to the table, and just, you know, we need to act more like a community. And it's a little bit hard, I know, with the right now with the pandemic. You know, smiling more often would probably make a big difference in everybody's lives. You know, but the numbers, you know, they're there. We see it. We were seeing it before the pandemic. So, you know, COVID is added. I mean, and I don't want to stress a lot on COVID, but, you know, and we don't have all the information yet, because I'm sure, I mean, we're seeing the difference right now. We're seeing the increase of clients that are coming to us right now due to our current situation. So, I mean, is there a different approach necessarily? Or is it really just depends on, you know, really what the situation is with the kids when you see them? I mean, I don't know if being everything still virtual, which, you know, it's a great thing in many ways. And it does keep us connected, where it would be worse if we didn't have it, because then we wouldn't be connected at all. Right. So there is a lot of pluses, don't get me wrong. But, you know, when you're seeing kids that might not have necessarily have been here, you know, but because of that self-isolation has really triggered something. Is there a different approach with dealing with that at all? Or is it just really depending on whether it's leaning more towards that anxiety or depression or?
So for me, and I'll speak only for myself, as a therapist, I really like to not generalize. So when I see a client, I like to think of that client as having, you know, a unique experience, a unique story. And from there, I work with that client, because I think that when we generalize and we say, oh, this child is depressed, so I'm going to do X, Y, Z, you're really missing a lot of what that unique person brings to the table, and their unique strengths and their unique abilities that could help you, you know, help them later on in life. So I really treat everyone independently of what their diagnosis is, or what their presenting problem is, because honestly, it varies. My version of what I look like anxious is not what you look like anxious. So it really varies from person to person.
Right. So let's backtrack a little bit with going back to the self-harm, because I know we don't hear a lot about it, you know, until it's really big. But what are, you know, aside from really seeing, okay, are they wearing long sleeves? I mean, is there any one particular part of the body where is it generalized at all, where they start, you know, if they're cutting? Or
it depends. I've seen, you know, cuts on arms, and I've also seen cuts on thighs, because it's an area where it's not generally seen by a lot of people. I've seen, you know, cuts on the hands, on the inside of the hands, on the bum of the hands, just different places. So I don't really think there's a general starting off place. Just like I don't think there's a general, at least in my opinion, a general tool in order to inflict self-harm, because I've seen, you know, razors from actual shaving razors being used, and I've seen broken pieces of mirror, broken pieces of glass, pen caps, even the most basic of things can be used to inflict harm if the teenager or the child wants to inflict harm. So I really do think it depends.
Yeah. And that's, and again, I'm generalizing because I'm not that familiar with it, but is that usually when you know that it's a symptom of something else that's now you're getting to the critical stages of what the underlying issue is? Or could that be a first time offense, not offense, but, you know, something that they just started doing? Like some might act out in anger, or not doing their homework, or you know, misbehaving in class or at work, or whatever the case might be. Do you find that there is some kind of trend that it then becomes the cutting, or it doesn't really matter?
I think, I know I already said this, but I think it depends on the person. So I think that for some people, you know, the underlying depression and anxiety, they wouldn't harm themselves. They just wouldn't do it. That I've actually had conversations with clients in the past where they say to me, you know, I would never do this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, and because I am a therapist that focuses on safety, I ask all my clients on a weekly basis, have you thought about self-harm? Have you thought about, you know, suicide or
Mm-hmm.
homicide? Because that's also a big one that we need to find out about. And so I'm always asking them, and some of them say to me, I would never do that. And
Mm-hmm.
so just because someone has been diagnosed with depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, bipolar, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to self-harm
Mm-hmm.
or die by suicide. However, I read in this book that 95% of people who die by suicide did have a diagnosis. So they were diagnosed with some sort of mental health problem. And so I think it's important, and that's why I stress a lot to everybody, not just kids, teenagers, or parents, that therapy is important. Therapy is a safe way for anybody to let out their feelings and talk about what it is that they're feeling and going through. That way they feel that connection. They feel supported by somebody. Even if they don't feel comfortable talking to parents, they have somebody else that they can speak to.
Some kind of support system.
Yeah.
And it doesn't matter the age. I mean, you know, we talk to our friends all the time, right? Which are our peer group. So I would imagine it's the same with kids. Topics might not be as extensive or as deep necessarily. Well, nowadays they might. Kids are much older than they are in their chronological ages these days, you know, so I can see that happening. So let's talk a little bit more about some of the gender differences. You know, we know with the females and the males, and then the different orientations and all that makes a difference. But I don't know all the numbers, you know, in general. I do know that that we have, again, looking at Broward County, there's a big difference in Broward County above the national average. But do you have a different approach at all when you're dealing with the different genders? Or is it, and I know you mentioned that it's really the one client is going to be an independent of itself, but is there any different approaches that you specifically use just when you're dealing with sensitive issues?
Well, I think that with any issue that's being presented to me, so during my master's, I really, and it's not a type of therapy that a lot of people have heard about, but it's feminist therapy, and it's not something that's very well studied, but it's something that really attracted me to what they were basically saying. And it was basically saying, you know, therapy, so feminist therapy is more of a lens. It's actually not like a model of therapy. So you could use it, let's say you're a collaborative therapist, you could have a feminist lens. Let's say you're a solution-focused therapist with a feminist lens. And it's just a way of seeing the person who's sitting across from you as a product of the society that we're in. And so a lot of it is looking at how does your gender affect what's going on today? How does your gender affect who you are as a person? So for example, for women, we know generally, and this is a huge generalization, women are, you know, they grow up being told to express themselves, to take care of others, to put others before themselves, to take care of their home, take care of their kids, be nurturing, be nice, be, you know, submissive. Whereas men are generally taught, you know, you need to be dominant, you need to not express your feelings, you need to keep your feelings to yourself. You're not allowed to cry, you're a boy, boys don't cry, and so forth. And so a lot of what I like to do is look at how, you know, that upbringing of your gender really affects what you're going through right now. And going back to, you know, the differences, it could be that the difference between genders is also due to the fact that as a society, we make it easier for women to talk about what they're going through. We make it easier to talk about their feelings and what it is that they're going through, whereas men might feel like they can't talk about it. They have to keep it inside.
Yeah, and we have, it's almost a 50-50 split here with men and women, you know, so it's not, even though we tend to want to speak more or we're raised that way, you know, it's across the board. It really is across the board. There is no discrimination whatsoever, you know, because I'd say we probably have, it's, you know, 51-49% split here. So it's interesting to see that, which, and I would think based on, you know, like the Z generation is probably more open to mental health, right?
Yes.
As opposed to the older,
Yes.
you know, baby boomers and all the other, I can't even name all the generations because I'm not that good at it, but I know with the millennials and the Zs is definitely more open to it, which is great, which is where, why one of the things that we have here at TBH is that we have our educational outreach program, because we are in the meat of the schools. We're talking directly with the kids because they are more open, and you would be surprised, not you, but sometimes it's surprising to see that kids will come up to our therapists and talk to them, say, hey, you know, whether they know a friend that's having a problem right now or they're having a problem right now. And as parents, we need to jump on board. We need to be okay with it, because there's nothing wrong with it. And we don't want to wait until we're at a level 10. And we talk about that all the time. And we're seeing these huge increases, you know, I mean, the pediatric ER increases for mental health is at 60% increase. And more than 50% of those cases are between the ages of 15 and 17. So we're not talking about little ones. So, and it didn't just start yesterday, right? So I'm sure that when we look at whether there is an episode or whether you know, someone has died by suicide, it's not something that just happened. It's taken a while to get to where now you're at a 10. And so now you're having to rush your kid to the ER because you don't know what to do. So, you know, as parents, we do need to open our eyes and be okay with it. We, you know, not only we're raising awareness, but we want to get rid of that stigma, you know, because, you know, we tutor our kids, you know, that doesn't make them dumb. So, you know, what's wrong with helping them through different stages in their life, you know, and sometimes some of us need a little more help than others, you know, and again, you know, we always talk about there's nothing wrong with that. So it's interesting to see the difference in the generations, how, you know, they're more flexible, more open, and which is a positive, you know, that's definitely a positive outlook in life. And hopefully, you know, we will become more of that household name where, you know, people it's okay to get that checkup. We talk about that checkup. Our Wellness Wednesdays, where we talk about the different coping skills. We talk about different activities that you can do in addition to, you know, seeking counseling, you know, because it's not just one thing, right? So, so why don't we talk a little bit about like some of the other, and not necessarily coping skills, but what activities, certain things that we can help with our kids, and giving them some things that they can be doing that helps their mental health in addition to counseling. Because it's, you know, obviously once you walk out the door, you have to continue. You have another 23 hours of the day. So, so what else can we be doing to give them that better health?
And I think that a big part of, you know, quarantining and being indoors, I think a lot of people are forgetting to get out into nature. So even, you know, just walking around, going to a local park, these are still things that can be done with social distancing. So it's not, you're not limited by that. You know, going on a canoe ride, if, you know, that's something, I think there's local state parks that are still doing canoeing and kayaking. So those are always great options because it's a chance to unplug. You don't necessarily have to have your phone on you. It's something that can be done as a family, or even, you know, one parent, one child. And so getting out into nature is always a good one for me. Also exercising 3 to 4 times a week so that, you know, you get that adrenaline going. It helps with stress so much. You know, exercise is just good for you in general, for your mental health and for your physical health. Dancing, cooking, kickboxing. I've seen kids get really creative with what their interests are, and it's all about, at the end of the day, it's all finding what interests the child or the teenager and what they're willing to do. Because if you tell them exercise 3 to 4 times a week and they hate exercising, it's not going to happen.
It's not going to work.
You have to meet the person where they're at, and I think that's the most important thing.
And part of that is because would you say that when you're doing that activity, you're in that moment? You're not thinking about
Yes.
anything else that's going around. So obviously if you're canoeing, you need to make sure you're canoeing straight and you know where you're going. So that's part of
Yes.
that, just blocking it out. We talk about music, right?
Yes.
Because, and again, and it's not to say that with all the technology and everything that we're doing now and being on electronics, I mean, music does so many different things, you know, and there's different sounds, because it doesn't, you have music, you have the nature sounds, you have the
Right.
waterfalls, you know, all these different things that really put people at peace and focus. So those, you know, buffer earphones or whatever that kids use these days. I don't know. We used to just blast a big radio station.
Boombox.
Yeah, so it's a little bit different, but that actually makes a difference. So these are some of the things, and some of the things that we try to bring to the table, because we have so many activities that we can do here in Broward County alone, which is part of what we try to bring, you know, our community together. Because, you know, as Daphne said, not everybody might want to be in nature necessarily, right? But not, or do an exercise. Like, I don't love to exercise, but I know I feel good after I exercise. So it's finding that, you know, we put our kids through that when they're small. We put them in the t-ball and soccer and the mini basketball and all these things to see what they like.
Right.
You know, it should be no different now when we're older, right? And there are a lot of resources, even when our kids get into college years. And this is, I think, sometimes, you know, that whole transitioning, which is another milestone, right? From transitioning from high school to college, is finding what those resources are. And the colleges do have a lot of resources. So is being able to find what they are so that they can actually go and investigate to find what might be their interest today, because it might not be the same as what it was before, right? You were the baseball star, and now you go to college, you don't want to be that baseball star anymore. There might be some other interest. So that's where we talk about the importance of all these activities and what they do. And obviously they put you at peace and they get that adrenaline going in a good way, So I know we're running down with our time. So if there are any questions, this is the time, you know, any other questions that we might not have touched on, feel free to put it in the Q&A or in the chat, and we make sure we can get that answered to you.
And I think that one of the topics that it's kind of last minute kind of thing, but you mentioned LGBTQ plus teens. Like, that is a very big group that is being affected by suicidal ideation and actually completing suicide. And I think it's very important to remember that being a teenager is not an easy thing to do. You know, you're going through all these changes. You feel like nobody understands you. You feel like, you know, your parents are doing XYZ against you. Your friends might be your friend one day, but then the next day they're not. So not only are you going through the stressors of being a teenager, but on top of that, you're, you know, questioning your sexuality, or you're scared to come out, or you're, you know, you don't know what to do. And so I actually did my doctoral research and project on Latinx LGBT adolescents, because they are actually being affected by suicide at a disproportionate rate. I think that LGBT adolescents are 3 to 4 times more likely to attempt suicide. And so this is a population that really needs support and connection in any way possible. And so I know there are several LGBTQ plus agencies in South Florida that are available. And we also, as therapists here, are able to have LGBTQ plus clients.
Yeah, the numbers are very disproportionate, because we're looking, again, now we're just talking Broward County. Percentage of students who have actually attempted suicide, if we look at heterosexual, it's 7.7%. And the GLB, which is a gay and lesbian bisexual, is 26%. That's a huge difference. So and the numbers don't even match, right? Because it's not, you know, it's not 50-50 or anything like that. So
no,
that
actually they're a minority. It's a small percentage of teenagers. Maybe now with Gen Z, it might be a little bigger because they are more willing to disclose their sexual orientation, or whether or not they even identify with any sexual orientation. But it's a smaller percentage because the majority of people identify as heterosexual.
Right. So there's a question about the services that we provide. You want to touch on that, Daphne?
Sure. So we provide individual therapy that could be based on the presenting symptoms. It could be 1 to 2 times a week. We also provide family therapy, couples therapy as needed. But specifically with teenagers, teenagers and children, we try to do at least once a month of family therapy. It's actually one of the big things here is trying to do as much family therapy as possible because, you know, children and teenagers don't exist in isolation. They are a part of this other system that they, you know, deal with on a daily basis. And so we also provide the intensive outpatient program for teenagers who have a history of substance use. So that's 9 hours a week of therapy for them, including individual and group. And we also have outpatient groups for kids who come to groups once a week and then do their individual therapy week.
For with most of the major medical plans out there, so and there's quite a bit of benefits through your health insurance that will cover mental health services, and we do accept Medicaid as well, and we have a sliding fee scale, so we really do try to make sure that we could accommodate all the financial needs, and we do have some financial assistance as well. Because the last thing we want to do when someone comes to our doors is to turn them away. So we do everything possible to be able to accommodate their financial needs and their mental health services here, to be able to, you know, we know what, based on all the cases or kids that have issues and concerns, more than 50% of them are not getting the treatment that they need. So the last thing we want to do is once they come, you know, they actually come and seek for help, that we turn them away. So we have different levels of being able to accommodate them. But if they have insurance, you know, there's quite a bit of coverage there as well, which helps soften or lower the cost of coverage. We are outpatient, as Daphne mentioned, so we don't have inpatient services. We do have a psychiatrist on staff as well when there's some for medication management for those that are seeing our counseling services. So, and I think...
Oh, and Kat was just recently trained in EMDR, so that's exciting.
Yes, yeah. So we have, you know, each one of our therapists they do a wide variety of services, counseling, but they have different niches as well. So one of the beauties, you know, what I'd like to look at, that what sets us apart is that we're a stigma-free environment. We're a very home-like environment. We are in a residential neighborhood, and they're little houses actually. You know, because of the staff that we have, our wonderful staff, you know, Daphne is one of them. But we have the resources to be able to put your children with who we feel would be the best fit. So we have some choices there, which makes it a lot nicer. And, you know, of course, as individuals, we need to do our due diligence and be our patient advocate. And as parents, we need to do that for our kids. But we have the resources here, and variety, I'd say, if you want to call it that, to be able to find that good match for your children. So that is, you know, one of the things that I love to talk about, you know, that I'll brag about, because you know, that's one of the things that attracted me over to the Bougainvillea House. But with that, I want to thank everybody for participating and joining us today.